And again, with that undocking confirmed at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling 260 statute miles over western Argentina. Again, this marks the completion of NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission to the space station.
Station Houston, Dragon departure burn 0 complete.
And there you now have a live look of the Dragon spacecraft as it continues to back away from the International Space Station. And we do have confirmation that that first departure burn was completed. That was a 17-second burn and the first of 4 departure burns, which helped to move Dragon further away from the International Space Station. The next burn will be in about 4 minutes, around 11:10 a.m. Central, 12:10 p.m. Eastern, and that is departure burn 1. That burn will last about 24 seconds, and it will help move the spacecraft beyond the keepout sphere. And we're going through another brief loss of signal, or LOS, as the ground stations transition out as part of the tracking and data relay satellite system known as TDRS. The departure of Dragon continues to proceed as planned. The spacecraft is about 40 meters away from the International Space Station now, and again, it'll exit the keepout sphere, which is the first invisible boundary around the space station that governs arriving and departing spacecraft once it hits that 200-meter mark. And for those of you who may just be joining us, about 3 minutes ago at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, the Dragon spacecraft supporting NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission to the International Space Station successfully undocked from the forward port of the station's Harmony module, completing an approximately 6-month mission where it spent its time docked, delivering science and cargo to the space station crew. It also performed a series of reboosts, 6 in total, with the last one being in January, and now we have those live views back. And you can see Dragon there in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen as it continues to back away from the International Space Station, again with that physical separation taking place about 4 minutes ago. Dragon is now about 75 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to increase that distance. The next departure burn will take place in about 1.5 minutes. It'll be a 24-second thruster firing, and that will help push the spacecraft beyond the keepout sphere, which is that 200-meter invisible boundary around the space station. And we're now about 1 minute away from that second departure burn, known as Depart Burn 1. The first departure burn is known as Depart Burn 0, and that took place about 30 seconds after the physical separation, and it was a 17-second burn, and that burn was executed as planned and helped to push Dragon further away from the International Space Station after its physical separation and first 2 thruster firings, which are known as Undock Burn 1 and 2. Dragon is now about 130 meters away from the International Space Station, so about 70 meters away from crossing the keepout sphere. Again, the keepout sphere is that first invisible boundary that the spacecraft will cross on its departure today. The second boundary being the approach ellipsoid, or the AE. The AE is further out and it measures 2 by 2 by 4 kilometers around the International Space Station. And they are both invisible boundaries that govern arriving and departing spacecraft.
Station Houston, departure burn 1 complete.
And we have confirmation there that the departure burn 1 is complete, so we are now just standing by for confirmation that Dragon has exited the keepout sphere. And Dragon has now officially exited the keepout sphere. It's about 230 meters away from the International Space Station. Again, the keepout sphere is an invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station that is monitored by flight controllers to govern
Station Houston, Dragon has exited the keepout sphere.
And there you heard that call up from the Capcom, or capsule communicator, Costa Mavridis here in Mission Control Houston, that Dragon has exited the keepout sphere. Again, the keepout sphere is that invisible 200-meter line centered on the space station that is monitored by flight controllers to govern spacecraft that are approaching and departing the International Space Station. The next milestone that we are looking forward to on Dragon's departure today will take place in about 12 minutes. And that is when it will exit the approach ellipsoid. We're expecting that exit to take place around 11:24 a.m. Central, 12:24 p.m. Eastern. The approach ellipsoid is another imaginary shape, this time a three-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers in the same family as the keepout sphere. After the spacecraft crosses the approach ellipsoid, joint operations will end and we'll wrap our coverage, and then responsibility for the spacecraft is also handed back to the SpaceX flight control team in Hawthorne, California. After Dragon exits the approach ellipsoid, there are still several milestones that the spacecraft has to go through in preparation for its deorbit and splashdown early tomorrow morning. Again, that splashdown expected around 1:44 a.m. Central tomorrow morning, which is 11:44 p.m. Pacific time off the coast of California. After the approach ellipsoid exit, there will be 2 more departure burns in that series of 4 departure burns. And there will also be a departure phase burn before they get into the rapid sequence of re-entry operations, with the deorbit burn planned for early tomorrow morning on Central Time, so 12:52 a.m. Central, 10:52 p.m. Pacific later today. After that deorbit burn takes place, Dragon will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. It will deploy its drogue parachutes, followed by its main parachutes, before finally splashing down off the coast of California to fully conclude its mission. We won't be providing live coverage of that splashdown, but you can continue to follow along for updates on the International Space Station blog. And you're continuing to see a live look of the Dragon spacecraft as it continues to depart the vicinity of the International Space Station. It's now a little over 400 meters away from the space station following its undocking about 10 minutes ago. That physical separation took place at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern. For those of you who are just joining us, the Dragon spacecraft for NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission safely undocked from the International Space Station at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern, as the space station was traveling about 260 statute miles over western Argentina. Following physical separation, Dragon used its Draco thrusters to complete departure burns 0 and 1. These departure burns are carefully choreographed maneuvers that increase the distance between the spacecraft and the space station. Shortly after completing departure burn 1, Dragon exited the keepout sphere about 6 minutes ago, and Dragon is now about 520 meters away from the space station. The keepout sphere is a 200-meter invisible boundary around the space station. It's one of several safety zones set up to govern visiting spacecraft either arriving or departing the space station. Before moving into the keepout sphere, spacecraft have to be configured where they would not cross the imaginary boundary for at least 4 orbits, even if the spacecraft lost all maneuvering. We are now standing by for Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid, which is another imaginary shape similar to the keepout sphere, but this time a 3-dimensional ellipsoid measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers. One of the key differences with the approach ellipsoid is that spacecraft outside it have to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours, again, even if we lost all maneuvering. And we are expecting Dragon to exit the approach ellipsoid in about 6 minutes, around 11:24 a.m. Central, 12:24 p.m. Eastern. And you're continuing to see those live views of the Dragon spacecraft as it departs the vicinity of the International Space Station. It's now about 635 meters away from the space station. It undocked from the space station's Harmony module on the forward port. Currently, the space station is traveling about 260 statute miles over the South Atlantic Ocean. The individual who helps provide some of these views of these arriving and departing spacecraft is the CRONUS position here in Mission Control Houston, and CRONUS stands for Communications RF Onboard Networks Utilization Specialist, and they help manage all of the space station's computer networks and comm systems, and they also help with some of these fantastic camera views that we're able to get during these dynamic operations. As we continue to monitor Dragon's departure from the International Space Station as part of NASA's SpaceX 33rd Commercial Resupply Services mission, the Dragon, now about 740 meters away from the International Space Station, we're standing by for the exit of the approach ellipsoid, again, that 2 by 2 by 4 kilometer boundary around the space station. The Dragon spacecraft for this mission launched on Sunday, August 24th atop a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, and the mission delivered new scientific experiments and cargo to the space station. One of those experiments was known as Microgravity-Associated Bone Loss B, or MABLE-B, which is a study of bone-forming stem cells and microgravity, which could provide insight into the basic mechanisms of the bone loss astronauts experience during long-duration spaceflight ahead of future exploration to the Moon and Mars. The Dragon spacecraft also introduced a new capability to reboost the International Space Station, helping maintain its altitude and counter atmospheric drag. During its time docked to the space station, Dragon performed 6 total reboosts. Dragon is now a little over 800 meters away from the International Space Station following that physical separation at 11:05 a.m. Central, 12:05 p.m. Eastern.
Houston, station on 2 with an HTVX end cone stowage question.
Go ahead for HTVX.